For a while now, horror movies have been in a weird state. Mainstream horror movies have ranged widely from groundbreaking and different with films like Get Out and The Invisible Man remake to it's okay with films like 2018's Halloween to whatever It Chapter 2 was trying to be.
It's real. It's real. It isn't happening. It isn't real.
But where horror has truly shined for the past several years has been on the indie side of films. Many films like The Witch, The Lighthouse, and Hereditary have truly been different and unlike any horror films that came before. But there's one subgenre of horror that is often overlooked and rarely talked about, that being terror-parody. What I refer to as terror-parody are horror films that are either satires like The Cabin in the Woods, spoofs like Young Frankenstein, or parodies like the Scary Movie franchise. Rarely are these films ever referred to when anyone discusses horror films and how influential many of them can be. Personally, I think a reason why many don't discuss this subgenre is that no one can really identify where certain horror films can stand in these three categories. Is it a satire, a spoof? What is it? Well, that's what I want to answer. I want to identify satire, spoofs, and parodies, what's their differences and similarities, and what kind of horror films fit into these categories. I think that if I can answer these questions, then people will be able to gain a better appreciation for this subgenre of horror films. The first thing we have to do is we need to identify what is a satire, a spoof, and a parody. First, let's identify satire. According to dictionary.com, satire is defined as the use of irony, sarcasm, ridicule, or the like in exposing, denouncing, or deriding vice, folly, etc. When a satirical film is made, it's usually to expose some kind of fault within our society in a comedic way. This not only brings a level of enjoyability to the audience, but it causes them to think deeper about what the film is trying to say. Films like 2019's Jojo Rabbit are considered to be satires since the film satirizes the Nazi party and points out how ridiculous, stupid, and terrible everything the Nazis did/are. Filmmakers like Mel Brooks are especially famous for making satires, but more on him later. Now this is where things begin to get a bit more complicated. A huge issue with spoof and parody is that they're too similar. Both definitions from dictionary.com and Merriam-Webster define them as being imitations to make fun of something or someone. There's no real difference between the two of them. When someone refers to a spoof movie, many will say something like the movie franchise, like epic movie or superhero movie, and many will say a parody movie will be something like Robin Hood Men in Tights or The Naked Gun. But many will also flip these around and say one is the other. So who's right? And truthfully, the answer is they're both right. Both genres are imitating something or someone for comedic effect, so in turn, a movie like Blazing Saddles can be considered both a spoof or a parody, depending on who you ask. So how am I going to define what movies are spoof and which ones are parodies? Well, for the sake of this video, I'm going to define movies like the Scary Movie franchise as parody movies since they take up a much wider range of movies, and movies like Young Frankenstein will be considered spoofs since it's only making fun of one movie. Now that that's taken care of, let's continue. I think it would be wrong to talk about satire, parody, and spoof without mentioning the man that redefined the genre, Mel Brooks. If that name is somehow not familiar to you, Brooks is the man that redefined satire and spoof comedy with films like The Producers, Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, and Spaceballs. Brooks has worked in Hollywood since the 1950s, working on shows like Your Show of Shows and creating Get Smart, which would later be rebooted in 2009 starring Steve Carell and Anne Hathaway. After working in television for over a decade, Brooks moved into feature films with a little movie called The Producers. This was the first satire of his career and it wouldn't be the last. The Producers is about two men that want to mooch off of Broadway patrons by making a musical in very, very poor taste called Springtime for Hitler. The film wasn't a huge success at the time, but did win Brooks an Oscar for Best Screenplay at the 1969 Academy Award. The film would later find cult status, be adapted into a hit Broadway musical, which would later be turned into a major Hollywood film starring Nathan Lane and Matthew Broderick. Brooks would later go on to make multiple satires and spoof movies like Blazing Saddles, a satire and spoof on racism and westerns, Young Frankenstein, a spoof on Frankenstein, Spaceballs, a spoof on Star Wars, and Robin Hood Men in Tights, a spoof on Kevin Costner's Robin Hood Prince of Thieves. Because of Mel Brooks' films, Hollywood began to take notice of how good and profitable spoof and parody films could be. This led to a surge in these kinds of films like Airplane and the Naked Gun trilogy. Sadly though, spoof and parody films are not what they once were. When Scary Movie released, this caused a shift in how parody films would be made. Instead of parodying one film or genre, now these films would spoof as much as they could, mainly what was popular at the time. Since then, we got what is deemed as the movie franchise. The scary movies, superhero movie, epic movie, so on and so forth. Instead of trying to deliver smart and clever comedy, these films became occupied with playing characters from famous movies in comedic scenarios and throwing as many references as they could with no rhyme or reason to them. Since then, the only major parody movies to come out have been the Haunted House movies and 50 Shades of Black. So what separates these genres and what brings them together? While they all revolve around comedy in some fashion to make fun of something or someone, it's satire that stands out above spoof and parody. Spoof and parody are mainly making fun of something/someone because it's funny, while satire is making fun of them for a purpose, to drive a bigger message home. There's nothing wrong with how any of them do it, but there is a clear distinction between satire and spoof and parody. So how does horror fit into this? Well, while there may not be many horror spoofs and parodies made these days, there's still plenty of horror satires being created. Films like Get Out satirizes white liberals and wokeness in today's culture and how what they're doing is also racist. The Scream franchise is very notable for really starting to point out the flaws and tropes within the horror genre and how cliche the slasher genre can be. What makes horror satires stand out amongst other satires is that these films take themselves seriously and try to deliver the film in a realistic and believable way despite making fun of many tropes in the horror genre. However, there's one horror satire that stands above the rest in its total destruction of the horror genre, and that film is The Cabin in the Woods. Be forewarned, from now on there will be full spoilers for The Cabin in the Woods, Young Frankenstein, and Scary Movie. If there's any others, I'll let you know. The Cabin in the Woods was written by Josh Whedon of Buffy the Vampire Slayer fame, and Drew Goddard, who recently wrote Cloverfield, who also made his feature film directing debut with this film. The film begins as standard as a horror movie like this could go. 5 teens go on a trip to a cabin in the woods for a fun getaway, but it quickly turns terrible when zombie hillbillies begin to attack and kill them one by one. Now, with that statement, you probably rolled your eyes and thought, well, that sounds cliche and bad, and you're right to do so. But here's the catch. They're being controlled by a secret government organization. Everything that's happened to them has been carefully planned and controlled by this organization so that they can be sacrificed to God so that they won't destroy the earth. As Anakin Skywalker said,
"This is where the fun begins."
What's genius about this premise is that it's a perfect setup for showing how formulaic and cliche horror films have gotten. The ritual requires there to be 5 teens, 1 a jock, 1 a virgin who has to be female and has to die last or can live but must suffer, the dumb blonde, the stoner, and the geek. What's interesting though is that as the film begins and progresses, we see that these characters aren't really like their archetypes. The jock is actually at their school on an academic scholarship, not for sports. The dumb blonde is actually a brunette who's smart, the virgin is not a virgin, and the stoner is actually the one who figures out what's happening to them. The reason these characters turn into their archetypes is because the agency is controlling them. The blonde hair dye she uses causes her to be dumb and really intimate, the alcohol makes the jock an idiot who only makes bad choices, and the pheromones they pump into the cabin causes the virgin to want to get to third base with the geek. The only one that wasn't affected was the stoner because they didn't mess with his stash like they were supposed to. What's also important to the sacrifice is that the characters have to choose their fate. At one point they enter a cellar and find all manner of creepy stuff, and it's revealed that whichever one they choose to say read or open is the thing that comes to kill them. This is making fun of how basic and formulaic these films can be. What makes it even funnier is the agency has a betting pool as to which creature will be the one to kill them, and the board is filled with ridiculous but somehow believable choices like clowns, sexy witches, Kevin, and angry molesting trees. By the end of the movie, after every stereotypical thing can happen to this group, the stoner and virgin make it down to the control room and decide to let all the creatures loose, giving the agency a taste of their own medicine. The film then ends with Sigourney Weaver telling the virgin that in order for the world to live, she has to kill the stoner, but she doesn't. The stoner lets her get mauled by a werewolf, and the film ends with the gods rising to destroy the earth. While it seems like a simple and reckless decision to let the world die rather than one person, it's actually a pretty clever way the film's saying there won't be any sequels. Most profitable horror movies get sequels, because money, and they're 9 times out of 10 worse than the original. But here the film is saying, no, there will be no sequel, take that Hollywood. It's both a surprise and not a surprise that The Cabin in the Woods didn't do well at the box office, barely making over $90 million. While it was a critical success when it premiered, many moviegoers didn't like it. According to Screen Crush, it was reported that many moviegoers walked out of the movie. Screen Crush also makes the argument as to why many moviegoers didn't like the movie at the time was because if a horror movie, for example, does not meet the demands of strict character tropes and basic plot points, if it attempts to deviate for purposes of freshness and originality, the majority of viewers will end the world, that is, the movie in question, with a figurative bomb. That's not that hard to believe, as many groundbreaking and different horror films like Hereditary and Midsommar continue to be divisive among moviegoers. What makes The Cabin in the Woods stand out from all other horror satires is that it makes fun of the entire genre of horror itself, not just one subgenre like slasher films. Roger Ebert said it best in his review of this film by saying, "The opening scenes do a good job of building conventional suspense, the middle scenes allow deeper alarm to creep in, and by the end we realize we're playthings of sinister forces." By showing that there's a formula that must be followed and that it's all rigged from the start, it makes you sit back and really think about how formulaic so many horror films are. Joss Whedon said that this film is a love-hate letter to the horror genre, and that is incredibly true when you see this film. The film looks and feels just like many classic horror films like The Evil Dead, but has the sharp wit and humor of some of the best comedies to annihilate a genre that the creators clearly love. But at the end of all this, I think the question we really need to ask is, what the hell was Kevin? Seriously, I need an answer to that. Now let's look at a classic spoof horror movie, Young Frankenstein. Directed by Mel Brooks and written by Brooks and starred Gene Wilder, the film spoofs the classic 1931 film Frankenstein. Following a very similar plot, this film follows the grandson of Victor Frankenstein, the original creator, as he travels to Transylvania to sell his grandfather's estate, but instead discovers his desire to create a monster just like his grandfather, to hilarious results. Like The Cabin in the Woods, what makes this film really work, not only as a comedy but as a love letter to the original film, is that it looks and feels like it's from the 1930s. The lighting, production design, sound design, it all works together to fool you into thinking it's from the same time as the original film. No modern technology or references to pop culture, the film is very much contained in its world of spoofing this one film. So what makes it a spoof exactly? Well, I'll let this clip explain.
If you're blue and you don't know where to go to, why don't you go where fashion sits?
Seeing Frankenstein do a musical number with his creation is not something you would see in the original films, and definitely not in Universal's failed Dark Universe movies. Young Frankenstein takes scenarios and situations from the original films, but makes them ridiculous and shows the comedic possibilities with them and the characters. When you see the monster interact with a blind man, you don't expect the blind man to light his hand on fire, but it happens here. You also don't expect to see when the monster strangles Frankenstein that he has to play charades to get out of the situation, but that happens here. The film also features characters that are presented in ways that make fun of their tropes. Like Inga very much wants to sleep with Frankenstein, but he fails to see that until she blatantly has to say it. Other characters like Elizabeth could stand as a commentary on the films of the 1930s where they weren't able to physically touch in any manner, such as kissing because of the Hays Code at the time. What this film understands that films like the Scary Movie franchise fail to understand is that it's not pop culture references and throwing characters into situations from other films that make spoof movies work, but it's taking these characters and the situations they find themselves in and seeing the ridiculousness in what's happening and playing up how insane everything is that's happening. If we go back and look at the musical scene again, this is a callback to films like King Kong, where they show off the monster to the world, but instead of just strapping him to a chair to show him off, Frankenstein instead decides to show off what he can do through a tap dancing musical number. This not only points out how ridiculous this whole thing is, but it also makes the monster more of a character than he has been in most versions of Frankenstein. Coupled with the ending where Frankenstein transfers some of his knowledge into the monster, we can finally see what the monster would be like if he had actually become a full functioning person and in turn, a full character. Young Frankenstein stands out in the horror spoof genre mainly because of how smartly it spoofs the story of Frankenstein, and also just because of how hilarious it is. The film proved to be so popular that in 2007 Mel Brooks adapted it into a Broadway musical just like with the producers. Now what about horror parody films like the Scary Movie franchise? Well, like I mentioned before, what these films try to do is rather than stick to one film and make fun of the situations the characters find themselves in, these films would rather take the characters or famous people and throw them into scenes of other films with no real purpose besides it could be seen as funny. Roger Ebert said in his review of Scary Movie, "Shall I discuss the plot? There is none really. Only a flimsy clothesline to link some of the gags. The characters, they are all types or targets, not people. The dialogue, you can't review the dialogue in the original movies like I Know What You Did Last Summer because it is mindlessly functional, serving only to advance the plot. How can you discuss the satire except to observe it more mindless?" This could not be more true with Scary Movie. If we look at the story of Scary Movie, if you could call it that, is it combines the plots of horror films like Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer to give us a story of teens, played by 20 to 30 year olds, who have to survive and figure out who the Ghostface Killer is. What this film did that started the whole movie franchise is that it parodied not just one film, but multiple films. And when I mean multiple, It parodies horror films like Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer, Halloween, Scream 2, The Blair Witch Project, The Sixth Sense, I Still Know What You Did Last Summer, and other famous non-horror movies like The Matrix, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, American Pie, and The Usual Suspects. This formula would prove later to be successful, I guess, as all spoof and parody movies after Scary Movie would start to spoof multiple movies even if they were in the same genre they were spoofing. But does Scary Movie have any value in terms of commentary or just smart humor? Well, yes and no. If we look at the beginning of the film, it's a pretty funny and clever parody of the opening of Scream. The film casts Carmen Electra as Drew Barrymore's character and still says she's in high school, a joke that would later come up, as the Ghostface Killer calls her about her favorite Scary Movie. The scene plays out fairly similar, but then the insanity really begins to show. When she thinks the killer's at the door, she beats up kids with a baseball bat, a pretty funny subversion. Then when she has a table with weapons like a grenade, gun, and knife, she chooses a banana. Again, pretty funny. Then, when she runs outside, there's a sign that points to either safety or death, and she runs the way to death. The scene is pretty funny and good with its parody and satire of Scream and tropes of bad decisions in horror movies. Does the rest of the movie have the same kind of comedy and satire? Yes and no, but mainly no. This film has not aged well with its humor, and there's a lot here to offend a lot of people to kind of amazing levels, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. As a parody of horror films, Scary Movie does get the job done, but if you're looking for a more clever parody on horror movies, specifically famous horror movie monsters, then Hotel Transylvania is a really good one. Hotel Transylvania is about Dracula as he runs a hotel for monsters as a safe haven from the humans, but his daughter wants to go out and see the world and find her true love like her dad did. Then a human enters the hotel for the first time, and now Dracula has to figure out how to keep him hidden from the rest of the monsters. This film is really clever with its parody of the classic monsters, like Frankenstein has complete control of his body parts even when they're separated from him. The Invisible Man is only seen by wearing glasses, and the Wolfman has dozens and dozens of kids. We also find out from Dracula that he doesn't drink human blood but a blood substitute, and when Johnny asks does a wooden stake kill him, Dracula replies with, yes, but who wouldn't that kill? Making fun of the many tropes of the vampire genre. More things like Dracula being unable to hypnotize Johnny because he's wearing contacts, and his ability to completely freeze anyone adds onto the humor of vampires and their powers. At the end of the film, the gang tries to find Johnny so he and his daughter can be together, and this is the first time the monsters have been around humans in centuries, and they come to find the humans love them and aren't afraid of them anymore, subverting not only their expectations but the audience's as well. This stands true as many people are in love with horror films and the monsters that star in them. Hotel Transylvania is a really clever parody of monster movies and the characters from them, because the film puts them into scenarios we wouldn't think of and makes fun of their traits and characters as a whole, doing what films like Scary Movie fail to do. At the end of the day, satires, spoofs, and parodies can work really well in the horror genre. When a satire can make fun of tropes and make the audience think of how cliche some horror films are, then it's done its job very well. If a horror spoof and parody throws characters we know into situations that point out the ridiculousness of the original, then it becomes memorable. Do yourself a favor, check out some horror satires and spoofs. You might surprise yourself at how smart and hilarious they can be.